Welcome to our Wednesday webinar series. My name is Nancy McGee. I'm the Vice President of Education for the Commemorative Air Force. And today I have a really interesting, very different story to tell you. Actually, I'm not the one who's telling it. Brian Duggan's going to tell this story, but we're going to bring you a different perspective. You know, our webinars have been a mix of different topics, definitely warbird community, certainly war, but today we're going to talk about soldier dogs, and this is called Tales from the Mess Hall. I obviously am a dog lover. Those of you who've been through this webinar series have heard my bull mastiff, who sleeps at my feet here, bark when the feral cats run by the door or the window. So hopefully she'll be quiet on this one, Brian, but we're really excited about having you here. You are the author of General Custer, Libbie Custer and Their Dogs, A Passion for Hounds from the Civil War to Little Bighorn, and also the award-winning Saluki, the Desert Hound, and the English travelers who brought it to the West. And a result of 14 years of research in archives, museums, and libraries in 3 different countries. You're also the editor for McFarland Publishers' Dogs in Our World series, and you're a retired university technology educator with 33 years experience in the University of California and California State University systems. So welcome. I'm thrilled to have your expertise and hear some stories. As you and I have gone through this webinar practice, what I've learned about you, Brian, is you are an excellent storyteller, and you even defy my usual thought is, never let truth get in the way of a good story. But, your stories have a lot of great facts in them. So, Brian, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Well, thank you, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here and talking with you and your audience. As you say, I'm a storyteller. I like telling stories about dogs and history. And I think that's the best way you can learn from history is hearing the personal stories of people. I've always been interested in military history. I've been a dog person all my life. And to start off our webinar today, I've chosen this particular image. This is a rare photograph of Major Arthur Bentinck in Iraq in 1927, when Iraq was occupied by the British forces after World War I. And he's posed there with his 2 adult dogs below him on the horse, and their 2 puppies off to the side, and his bodyguard and soldiers are there. And I was actually able to get this photograph from Major Bentinck's great nephew, who's a friend of mine. And we were able to track down the tail number on that plane and found out that it saw service in World War I in Europe, and it was transferred to the Middle East. It saw service there for about a year before it finally cracked up and they scrapped it. And it's a de Havilland DH9 for those of you who track these sorts of things. But I just love this picture. I mean, it's kind of the culmination of a lot of my interests. So Nancy, if you want to give me the next slide. So here's proof that I am a dog person. This is a picture of me in 1958. Calla Dog Food had this gimmick where they would take an Irish Wolfhound around and you could get cart rides in the parking lot of a supermarket. And it was supposedly to promote how healthy the dog food was for you. And you could, this big strong dog ate the Calla Dog Food. And so, of course, being Irish, my parents had to take me to go have my ride in the dog cart. That's my younger brother Kevin in front of me in the cart. And then fast forward to a few years ago, this is myself with 2 of our Salukis in the Mojave Desert. And for those of you who may not know the breed, a Saluki is native to the Middle East. It's sometimes called an Arabian Greyhound or a Bedouin Greyhound, but they function very much like fast running dogs do anywhere in the world. And they typically would hunt desert hare and gazelle. And that's the breed of dogs that my wife and I have had for the last 40 or more years. So next slide, please. I've always been interested in dogs in the military, and for the last number of years, I've collected photographs, originals wherever possible, of dogs in the military. And here's just a few interesting photographs that I thought you might like to see. On the left is Fusilier Sergeant in the British Army. Actually, he's a color sergeant, and he's wearing 2 campaign ribbons, and he's sitting there with this big shaggy dog who obviously likes him, is turning his head up affectionately, and the dog is wearing a wide brass or possibly silver collar, which would have cost some money to have made. In the center, we have an American sailor on board a ship with 2 dogs. This was taken about 1907. And to the right is Sergeant Phil Lemon of the 82nd Airborne Artillery, and his dog Dick, who is also a Saluki that was adopted during the first Desert War in Kuwait back in the early 80s. And I actually know Dick, and he let me have some of these photographs, and I've written about Dick elsewhere. And then one of my most recent finds is this little postcard below, which shows a group of German soldiers from World War I. And you can see there's a German Shepherd puppy down at the bottom. And sitting to the left of the puppy is a general. I haven't figured out which general it is yet. And then there's another dog on the right belonging to an officer. And this is an adjutant's headquarters for field artillery. So in addition to being interested in soldiers and dogs, I also have an aircraft connection. Next slide, Nancy. There we go. All right. So my father, Jim Duggan, pictured below, was from Ireland, and Ireland was neutral during World War II. And he went to England to get war work. And the job he got was working at basically a field near Oxford, England, tearing apart wrecked planes. And they had one field for American planes, one field for British planes, they had one field for German planes. And this was because the planes all used different alloys, and so they had to keep the metal separate. And they would tear up these planes literally with axes and sometimes acetylene torches. My dad always told me how much he admired the American planes. You know, he said that, you know, they were as well constructed as the British planes and the German planes. He said, but there was something that was very, very elegant about the American design. It was cleaner, it looked a little nicer, and he was particularly enamored of the B-17. And he always talked about how much he admired the gentle sweep of the tail. He loved that. And he actually remembers the B-17s circling overhead as they would line up in formation to go off and do long-range bombing. So hearing these stories when we were a little kid, I was always kind of excited about this. But the very first B-17 I ever saw was in Tulare, California. And here's a picture of this that I've taken from the book about B-17s. And when we saw it in 1966, I was about 13 years old. It looked pretty much exactly like this. It had been in a field, an airfield, and it wasn't terribly well taken care of. And we hopped over the fence and poked around and tried to look in the windows and things like that. And that was my first experience with the B-17. My next experience with B-17 was in 1990. And there's the bottom picture of the Sentimental Journey, owned by the CAF, which came to San Jose in 1990 on a tour at the Jet Center there. And so that was the first B-17. I actually got to go inside and poke around, see take off, and it was a fabulous experience. So I've been in love with warbirds ever since. I've actually flown on the Sentimental Journey 2 years ago, and that was a bucket list thing for me. It was just absolutely fabulous. My brother flew with me. It was a fabulous experience. There's a lot more I could tell you about, you know, my own interaction with planes, but you're here to hear some dog stories. So next slide, Nancy. Now, in my book, General Custer, Libbie Custer, and their Hounds, I got started on that in 2011. Scottish Deerhound won Westminster Kennel Club Best in Show. That was a big deal. The dog that breed had never won it before. And my editor at one of the dog magazines I wrote for wrote to me and said, "Hey, would you like to do an article about General Custer's Deerhounds?" Well, I knew very, very little about General Custer at the time. I mean, I'd seen Little Big Man and that kind of wacky portrayal of General Custer. I really didn't know anything at all. So I started with a clean slate. I started reading everything I could find out about him. He was an enthusiastic owner of dogs. He was very much a human being. He was a son, he was a brother, he was a husband, he was a dog lover, and he was a good friend, you know, if you were in his circle. He gets a lot of controversy for some things, but he was a man of his time, and he loved his dogs. Now, these two photographs are very well known. These are held by the Library of Congress, the National Archives. And the first photograph, he is a lieutenant, and he's visiting a staff headquarters here. And you notice he has posed himself very carefully with this little tiny terrier in his lap on a little bit of a ground cloth. And if Custer didn't like dogs, that dog wouldn't have been in that photograph. Unfortunately, we don't know the dog's name. Next to that photograph is also Custer as the lieutenant. And this is a larger dog, probably a spaniel or maybe some sort of a retriever. The dog, you can see the dog's muddy and it's been out in the grass or the muck and doing something like that. And again, that dog was his dog. There's actually an account by Custer's school teacher who remembers seeing that dog come home during the Civil War when Custer was on leave. And there were stories told about how that dog had saved Custer's life once. Now, we don't know the names of these two dogs for sure. We know that Custer had 4, 5, maybe 6 dogs during the Civil War of different kinds. It's a little hard to say which are which because he oftentimes doesn't tell you in the letters that he's writing home. He'll just say the dog. Sometimes he mentions the breed. The only dog that we know for sure that has a name was a dog named Rose. And he doesn't mention the other dogs for us at all. So that's still a mystery. That stuff hasn't turned up. But the way you find out about these things are in letters. This stuff is not really in the history book unless a historian is interested in writing about the dogs. So Custer meets, during the Civil War, a beautiful young lady in Monroe, Michigan named Libbie Bacon. And Libbie Bacon was the daughter of a judge. She was the only child. She grew up, she was extremely well educated for the time. She was very vivacious. She was a great conversationalist. She was just a nice person to want to sit down and talk to. And Custer fell in love with her instantly. She wasn't impressed. He pursued her and finally overcame her father's objections when he was promoted to brigadier general on the eve of Gettysburg. And you know, what father with Union sympathies during the Civil War can ignore a suitor who is a brigadier general? And thanks for anticipating me, Nancy. So here's a picture on the left of Libbie Custer and George Custer. This is 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, or end of the major fighting of the Civil War. And he's wearing his major general's uniform because that was his final promotion at the end. You can barely see it here. He's got a red neckerchief that was kind of his signature costume piece that he liked to wear. His wife, Libbie, is dressed in a riding habit that she's had made to honor his uniform. So you see there's gold braid on the cuffs. There's gold yellow piping for the cavalry on the trim of the bodice. She's got brass buttons. She wears a black velvet jockey hat. She carries a riding whip. The woman that's with them is Eliza Brown, who was Custer's cook during the Civil War. She was a freed slave, and she decided to attach herself to Custer because the pay was good, the food was good. She liked bossing him around, and she knew it was not a bad job for a freed slave. And she was with the Custers for many, many years. She didn't always like all their dogs. After the major fighting is done in the East and Lee surrenders, Custer is sent to Texas for the very last of the fighting that's going on there. Actually, before he gets there, and his wife comes with him and his brother and eventually his father too, the fighting ends. And so now Custer is on reconstruction duty, and they're working on quelling the outbreaks of the Ku Klux Klan, the lawlessness that was going on. And so they're sent to Hempstead, Texas, which is near Houston. And this tintype below was actually hand colored at the time. It's Libbie Custer writing, and you can see how long the skirts were. And Libbie used to write about her skirts getting tangled in brush and twigs all the time. It was a bit difficult for her. In the center between the two of them, you can just see a blur of the back end of a greyhound. And that greyhound was given to the Custers by a friend in Detroit. The dog's name was Lord Byron. And he was a pedigreed greyhound. He had a fancy collar. He was a very smart hunter. He could steal meat from a boiling pot of water. He could run faster than anything. He could catch hare. He could catch deer. He didn't like much. He didn't care for much for Libbie, and Libbie didn't care much for him. But Custer liked him because he was a smart hunting dog. Now, at this point, Libbie's met Custer's dogs when they were campaigning in the Civil War. She always wanted to be with him or as close to him as possible. So she lived and roughed it a bit during the Civil War, and she got to know his first dogs then. and his horses then. She learned to ride because he expected her to ride. And the dogs were all over the place. She writes about them sneaking in the tent when it's raining and, hiding in the wagons and coming out when the trek was done for the day. But she's not really a dog person at this point. A couple in Texas who were friends of the Custers and originally from Virginia gave the Custers a pointer dog. And the pointer's dog was named Ginny for Virginia. And this dog took to Libbie, and Libbie took to Ginny. She was, by all accounts, a sweet, chummy dog. She was a good bird dog, but she had good manners. She liked being in the house. She liked being with the Custers, and Libbie fell in love. This was Libbie's heart dog, and she became a confirmed dog woman at that point. Now, Ginny sleeps in a basket outside the Custer's bedroom, and I'm going to read you a little passage from my book. Nancy, you can give me the next slide now. One morning, Libbie and Armstrong, and I'll point out here that Armstrong was what his friends and family called him. He always went by Armstrong. So Libbie and Armstrong missed hearing Ginny's wake-up call, her tail thumping on the floor. Her bed was empty, so Armstrong scrambled into his clothes and soon came back with the news that Ginny was under the servants' quarters with 7 other little Ginnies. The war hero, General George Armstrong Custer, eagerly wiggled into the crawl space and handed out the puppies to Libbie. Nothing would do but for her mother and the pulpy, silken, skinned little rolls to be placed in the Custer's bed to be admired and lovingly inspected. Libbie would refer to the happy event as altering the dog's census. They were delighted, but knew that Eliza would go on the warpath when she learned there was a litter in the bedroom, and she did. Did I come all the way down to this no-count country to wash white counterpanes for dogs? At each blast from the indignant Eliza, Armstrong would answer by talking sweetly to Ginny. It was a defense which even Eliza could not best, and he wore her down. With Eliza settled, the officers and wives trooped in to pay court to the puppies and Ginny, who responded by offering her paw. So this makes Libbie even more of a dog person. And the illustrations I'm showing you here are one from a book about Custer, describing what he might have looked like crawling under the house, the Major General dragging puppies out. I've included a snapshot from my own collection of Spanish-American war soldiers and a mother dog nursing her puppies to kind of give you the flavor of how the puppies were in the regiment. And then lastly, probably the only known photograph of Ginny that exists. And this was taken with the Custers in Dundee, Michigan in 1866. Ginny's moved a little bit and she's blurred, but it's the only photograph of a pointer dog. And the fact that she's so close to Libbie strongly suggests that it is in fact Ginny. And this does it. This makes Libbie a dog person. So now I'm going to jump back to the Custers later, but right now we're going to go 50 years later and 2 continents away. And next slide, Nancy. So I am sure that many of you have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia and about Major T.E. Lawrence in the desert. And so we're going to go to that part of the world and era right now. This is a photograph. T.E. Lawrence is seated in the chair in the center. And you can see that he's looking down at an officer by the name of Major Scott, and Major Scott is cradling a small dog in his arms. And this was locally known as the Bulgarian Weasel Hound, which presumably means it didn't have any particular breed. Next to these 2 men is a guy in a pith helmet, and that is Captain Goslit. And Captain Goslit was the supply officer at Aqaba. He was the one who arranged for all the food, all the ammunition, all the supplies coming and going for the desert raids. And positioned with him is his Saluki Snorter. Goslit actually had 2 Salukis given to him by the Arabs. The other one was named Musa, which is Arabic for Moses. We think that Snorter has to do with some personal habit. So, and this is the only picture of Lawrence of Arabia, 2 dogs. And this was taken by Lowell Thomas during his time in the desert. What I want to do is I want to tell you about the extraordinary adventures of another Englishman, and this time an artillery major, and his dog in the desert. So next slide, Nancy. So may I introduce you to Major Christian West Bain Jardine, DSO MC. And for those of you who don't know initials in the British Army, that's Distinguished Service Order and Military Cross. Major Bain Jardine was the son of a Scottish Presbyterian minister, and he joined the Royal Artillery after college. He served in India, and he served in Europe during the First World War. He was severely wounded in the back of his knee with a piece of shrapnel. He was sent home to recuperate in England, and after he was well enough to be on duty again, he was shipped to Italy for whatever the Royal Artillery was doing there in the last of the war. When the conflict in Europe was over, Bain Jardine and his artillery contingent were sent to Syria as part of the occupying forces. And if you remember the movie Lawrence of Arabia, they talked about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where Britain and France kind of carved up the Middle East between them. Initially, Syria was going to Britain, and so Bain Jardine was the artillery column as part of the occupying force. He was there, and he's never quite clear about this, but somebody gave him this dog, and her name is Hama, and she was a beautiful white dog, and her ears stick up a little differently than most Salukis you see. There were tribes in Syria that used to crop Saluki ears, and there are various odd reasons for doing this, and probably mostly it was just done because your father did it, your grandfather did it, and your great-grandfather did it. But anyway, Hama had these sort of unusual ears that stuck up. I was very fortunate to meet this man's son, Colin Bain Jardine, and Colin Bain Jardine, while I was writing Saluki, gave me free access to his father's war journal and his photographs, which was a great privilege. And I will say now that, and I've mentioned this before, when you read about dogs in history, typically historians don't write about them unless it's something significant like, you know, the Napoleon's dog peed on his boot and altered the course of Waterloo. Where you really read about dogs in the military are in the diaries and the journals and the letters that soldiers write back home, you know, where you get the, hey, honey, guess what Rover did today sort of thing. So we're very fortunate that Major Bain Jardine really loved his dog and wrote about them. So let's have the next slide. Nancy. So in Syria, they had this artillery column there, and they were sort of, you know, really poised to do something if the Turks were to rebel. And there wasn't a lot to do. It was kind of a dismal place to be. The rainy season was coming up. So a lot of what kept these guys happy was sports. And they hunted, they had paper chases, they had, you know, races and things like that. This occupied a large portion of their day because they had literally nothing else to do, being officers. You can see in this photograph, there's Bain Jardine at the bottom in more casual military dress. The picture above him is Hama, and that's Hopeless, who you'll hear more about in a second. And then there's a picture of a hunt with a whole mixture of dogs. The area that they were stationed in Syria was well known for having a population of jackal and desert hare, and so that's what they used to hunt every day, sometimes foxes as well too. So I'm going to read you a short passage from my book and from Major Bain Jardine's diaries. So he's with this column of artillery wagons full of ammunition for guns and rifles, and a lot of these are manned by Indian soldiers who were serving with the British at the time. And everybody just referred to this as the column, right? So Bain Jardine writes, to know the column, one had to know the dogs and the horses. Everything else hung on these. In his journal, Bain Jardine gives an eloquent and insightful description of the officers' dogs. There was Hardwick, a foxhound of some girth and age, often lame with rheumatism, but as obstinate as a mule and self-opinionated to a degree. There was Hopeless, a Great Dane by reputation, with about the smallest heart possible in a large body. There was Moggs, a blundering, fat black and white pointer pup with all the qualities of a retriever. And Daglio, otherwise known as the Rat. Daglio was a small, long, nondescript brown pup who got his name from me as he so forcibly reminded me of an Italian liaison officer in Italy in the early days. Last but not least, a tiny pup named Maggots. Hama had been part of the pack, but she had been temporarily lost at Gaziantep earlier in the year. As the column is moving out, Hama was left behind, and at the time, Bain Jardine did not elaborate as to the circumstances in his journal. As much as he worried about Hama, he could not leave his command to go and search for her. A month later, he and his men were at Hims, and with the arrival of the 19th Machine Gun Group on November 18th, young Hama was restored to her owner after being missing for 2 months. Bain Jardine wrote sarcastically, "And I also collected a white Saluki, which had been stolen from me earlier in the year at Gaziantep in Syria, which dog made a notable addition to our pack." 3 days later, they were ordered to turn over the remainder of their garrison to the French, who were now to occupy Syria and withdraw to the coastal town of Jaffa, some 175 miles to the south. During this march, Bain Jardine took steps to ensure Hama would not go missing this time. He placed Hama and Daglio in a baggage wagon in care of Habib, a Syrian boy who knew that looking after the major's dogs meant a ride. Also in the wagon was an Indian soldier who held on to Moggs and Maggots. Even though the wagon bounced and stopped and lurched and started, it was preferable to slogging through the muck with, as Bain Jardine says, half of Syria clinging to your boots. Hopeless, the Black Dane Cross had been scrounging in the camp's garbage heaps and was almost left behind. Strictly speaking, it was not a retreat, but the whole atmosphere was as dismal as if the column had been defeated in battle. The dogs were a bright spot in the whole operation, and all of them made it to Beirut except one. At Baalbek, Daglio raced forward to investigate some attraction at the head of the moving column and fell headlong into a deep well. No sign of the poor dog could be seen or heard, and a deeper gloom fell over the soldiers. There were happier memories in Jaffa. So Jaffa is a part of Tel Aviv now, and specifically it's a beach town. So happier memories in Jaffa included outings with his brother officers, and in particular rambles with Assistant Provost Marshal Dudding, who kept a male Saluki, coincidentally named Jaffa. The men and hounds would frequently go down to the beach to bathe and relax in the sand. In the fall of 1920, Hama had taken quite a fancy to Dudding and his hound, and she would run off to join them. Bain Jardine had to frequently drag her back home and noted dryly in early October, Dudding has evidently been petting her considerable. A week later, he had to tie Hama up to prevent her from running off to see Jaffa and Dudding. Bain Jardine received his demobilization orders to go home, and on November 20th, he and Hama embarked for Alexandria in Egypt. Gaskin, his orderly, had ensured that there were biscuits for Hama tucked away in his kit. Poor Hama was miserable throughout the voyage, and in the end was consigned to 6 months quarantine in England as a prevention for rabies. The cause of Hama's affection for Jaffa became obvious when her narrow waistline began to swell and her teats engorged with milk. She had mated with Jaffa in late October and produced a litter of 7 puppies in quarantine on New Year's Eve, 1920. So, next slide, Nancy. So, oh gosh, I forgot all about this. So here is just a recap quickly. Here's a picture of Hama herself, in fact, in Syria, and then here's a picture of the artillery column. You can see the wagons in the background. You can see Major Bain Jardine there in the very center, and to the right of him, you can see Hopeless, the Great Dane, and Hama in white. So Nancy, go ahead and shoot that over to the next slide. There we go. So here's one more picture from Bain Jardine's wartime album. This is a friend of his by the name of Lucas and his 2 Saluki puppies. This was taken in Alexandria, Egypt. It was quite popular for British soldiers to adopt these dogs. And then I have this great photograph of Hama gives birth to her puppies. She gets out of quarantine. And Bain Jardine is in Ipswich, which is near London. And he's very proud of Hama. He buys a Bentley. He takes her for a ride. She sits in the front seat with him. He has her portrait taken at a photographer's studio. She's a desert dog. She's used to coming and going as she wills. So she runs loose all the time, and he spends a lot of time tracking her down, apologizing to farmers, writing letters of apology. And he begins to realize that that army life in England on these posts are maybe not the right thing for a desert dog. This is a picture of her puppies when they're probably about 2-3 months old, and that's his orderly kneeling down with them. That's Bain Jardine bending over, and just in the background behind the orderly, you can see Hama's ear and neck. The decision that Major Bain Jardine came to, that it wouldn't be fair to keep Hama confined. The British Army tended to shift you from post to post about every 2 years, and he knew he was going to be spending the rest of his time in England. So he made the hard decision to give up Hama, and he contacted one of the Saluki breeders in England, and I think gave her to him. She ended up being a very prominent influence in English pedigrees. She had 7 or 8 litters when she was in England, and most Salukis bred in the Western world can trace their descendants back somewhere to Hama. He was a little bit recalcitrant in talking about her leaving. He only says in the diary, she left early today. And but there's this one point in his diary which just kind of shows you how much he loved her. He's talking about an afternoon they had out riding, and they're napping back in the tent of the bunk, and he calls her my queen, my snake, my agape dog. Now, Salukis tend to be sort of, you know, slithery. They can insinuate themselves into your arms and your lap, and I kind of think that's what my snake means. An agape dog, we don't know. I talked with his son about that, and it looks like it's sort of a mixture of Arabic and maybe Turkish. We think it probably means number one or the best or the greatest, but the fact that he called her his queen is just absolutely wonderful. So I was very privileged to be able to tell the story in my book. Now, the next story I'm going to tell you, we're going to go to the middle, we're going to stay in the Middle East, but we're going to jump up to World War II. So Nancy, if you please. Thank you. So this story started, now I'll tell you, this story is not in my book, but I did write an article about Hori, the Dinkum Rebel. This started, I bought a $1 book at a dog show, and it was titled The Desert Dog. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. It might have something to do with Salukis. Well, it didn't have anything to do with Salukis at all, but it had this fabulous story about this little mutt dog that was adopted by an Australian signal group in Egypt and stayed with them through the war. So Hori's story goes like this. This group of signals, a platoon of signalmen attached to a machine gun battalion, they're stationed in Alexandria, and Private Jim Moody is off on his motorcycle doing some sort of a field exercise. And on his way back to Alexandria, he spots this little dog hunting lizards in the rocks, in the desert, middle of nowhere. And the dog's friendly. So Moody picks up the little dog, stuffs him into his overcoat, and then drives the motorcycle back to Alexandria. And his platoon take an instant liking to the dog. The platoon tended to call themselves the rebels. And, you know, and in Jim Moody's own words, he says, you know, Australians are a bit of rebels anyway. They like to, you know, thumb their nose at authority, to use a proper expression. And these guys were even more rebels than the rest of them were. So they decided to keep Hori, even though there were orders that you couldn't have dogs in camp. He was named after, I think it was a rugby player by the name of Horace, and Hori was the abbreviation for that. So here you see Hori is actually howling to the accompaniment of a harmonica in camp. And they like this dog a lot. He guards their tent from the locals who tried to steal food and rations. There was a famous incident when the rebels were all on parade where the dog went up and peed on one of the corporal's boots, and then some local stray dog came over and peed on that corporal's boots. And of course, there was no order in the ranks after that. Everybody was cracking up and laughing. He was really everybody's pet. Everybody liked him. But, you know, in the Army, there are always orders to get rid of the dogs. Next slide, please. So the rebels would not get rid of Hori, and they figured out this clever dodge to hide him. And so during inspections and parades, the officer would go through the tents and make sure they were all, you know, shipshape in Bristol fashion. And they couldn't leave Hori in the tents because he discovered. So Moody took his knapsack and they made some hidden ventilation panels in the back. They trained Hori to sit in the back and be quiet, and then sit in the pack with it closed and be quiet, and then sit in the back in the pack on somebody's back. So what they would do is when they knew they were going to have inspection, they put Hori in the pack. Moody would wear the pack, and they'd go out and stand in parade. Their tents would be inspected, and then they'd go back in and Hori would be released. And so what you see here is Hori in his pack in the first photograph. In the second photograph, Hori is actually in that pack. Had they got to more strenuous inspections, like if they were going to be standing out in the sun or on maneuvers or something for a long period of time, they dug a trench under Moody's bench and covered it with a carpet, and Hori was trained to stay in the trench and be quiet until they came back to find him. And if they were really in trouble trying to hide Hori, they would loan him to another unit, and the other unit would hide Hori for them. And what was interesting was the officers all knew this was going on. They didn't know the mechanics of it, but Hori always came back after the orders to disappear or after the inspections, and they couldn't figure out how the Australian rebels did it, but they were always bemused to find Hori showing up again. At the lower right here is a picture of Hori on board a transport ship. He was a pretty amazing dog. He learned to identify the sound of German planes who were coming in for strafing runs, and he would alert the rebels with a bark. He was wounded once by shrapnel. He was almost crushed to death in evacuating a sinking ship in the Mediterranean. He was he'd go for walks. He would hitch rides on trucks, and he was once found in Jerusalem, 50 miles away, and then he was returned. So this was their heart dog. I mean, they weren't about to do anything to jeopardize Hori, except when the Japanese threatened to invade Australia. Australian government made the decision to withdraw Australian troops from the British, what they perceived as the British fight in Egypt, Greece, and Syria, and send them to defend the homeland. So the troops were all packed on board a ship, and the orders were no pets, no animals. Now, Australia has a very strict quarantine law. England had a 6-month law at that time. Australia had a 1-year quarantine. Very, very fearful of getting rabies in the country and then destroying the sheep population. So the rebels had to be very clever in figuring out how to get Hori home to Australia. So what they did was they got Hori in the pack. They got Hori past the officers on board the ship. They got Hori past the naval officers on board the ship, and they took over a compartment. And then the rule was that there was somebody always in the compartment with Hori. And if the secret knock wasn't given at the door, they'd bundle Hori into the knapsack, and then he would disappear when the stranger was in. And they did this for the entire voyage. It was probably something like 2 weeks to get from Egypt to Australia to Perth. And poor Hori, he's a desert dog. He's used to just peeing wherever he wants to in the desert, right? Well, he's so freaked out about being in this steel ship in this confined room that he doesn't pee for 3 days. Finally, they coax him into peeing in the shower drain after 3 days. So he makes it to in sight of Australia's shores. The ship stops dead in the water, and the captain says, "All right, we know that you guys have got, contraband dogs and cats. We're not going to go any closer to home until those dogs are surrendered." And they stayed there for 10 hours within sight of Australia as the quarters were searched and everything like that. And the rebels were very worried they were going to find Hori, and they knew what would happen if he was found. Somebody finally did find a cat that was on board the ship, and the cat was thrown overboard, and that's what happened to Hori. So the captain and the Australian officers think they found everybody, and they proceed to sailing to Perth, and then eventually to Melbourne and Sydney, and in the pack, and he's marched off the gangplank, and he makes it safe to Australia. Now, the rebels were clever fellows. They actually had him certified by a vet in Tel Aviv that he was free from disease, and they had him certified again when he got to Australia. And of course, the voyage from Egypt to Australia was essentially the quarantine period for rabies, but it was illegal to bring an animal into the country without going through the quarantine period. So Moody took the dog to his father in Melbourne, and the dog was quietly kept on Moody's farm. And the Australians were sent off to Australia to guard against the expected invasion from Japan. And at the end of the war, Moody comes back, and Hori's still with his father. And he unadvisedly takes Hori to a fundraising effort, and he shows Hori off as the dog that was with him in Egypt, Greece, and Syria, and was brought into Australia. Well, the Australian Health Department gets wind of this and demands that Hori be surrendered because the dog entered the country illegally. Well, they produce all kinds of evidence saying the dog's free from rabies, blah, 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 and it doesn't make any difference. The dog's in the country illegally. So there's all kinds of uproar in the press about this. People are just outraged that the dog, the companion, the mate of these soldiers is going to be surrendered to the government. And finally, it comes down to the fact that like there's going to be some, massively heavy fine or even imprisonment to Moody and his father if they don't surrender the dog. So Moody is in Sydney. He asks for 7 days leave to travel home to Melbourne, get the dog, and come back. And he's granted that. And he has to show up and surrender the dog for inspection, health inspection, when he comes back. So Moody goes home. Moody comes back on the 7th day, and he surrenders Hori to the authorities. And supposedly Hori is going to be vetted and checked and this, that, and the other thing. Well, that's not, in fact, what the government had in mind. And so Moody gets a call one evening. They put Hori to sleep. And this was a foregone conclusion, not because the dog wasn't healthy or anything like that. It was because the dog had come in without the quarantine. More uproar in the papers. There's public mourning for this. Everybody is very, very sad about this. This just really seems like the most horrible thing in the world, to betray your mate that had been with you through the army, through the war. Now, for 60 years, that's what Australia believed. As it turns out, Moody's family told a real story a few years ago that Hori was smuggled in sort of an underground railroad from family to friend to family to friend, and he ended up on a farm in another state in Australia and quietly lived out the rest of his life. He got fat, he sired puppies, and good call, Nancy. He got fat, he sired puppies, and eventually died of old age. Now, the wonderful thing about all this is that in the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra, I don't know if it's still there. It was there because I actually saw this in 2012. There's an exhibit just for Hori in the children's section of the museum, and you can see Hori's coat that the Australians made for him with his badges and medals. That's on display there. A replica of the backpack is there. They've got Hori's doghouse, and they've got the whole story told for the children. And what's interesting, if you read this, the lesson is what's most important is being a good mate, being a good friend. And even if it's breaking a law or thumbing your nose at a rule, the lesson for the kids here is that you take care of your mates. And I just think that was just absolutely marvelous and totally wonderful. So if you ever get to Australia, you can see these goodies. And some of these exhibits are actually online. If you go to the Australian War Memorial online and search on Hori or dogs, you can find nice images of this stuff. So go ahead and give us the next slide, Nancy. For the last part of my story, I'm going to go back to Custer and the American West and tell you more about both Custers, George and Libbie, Armstrong and Libbie. And this is an illustration that Libbie commissioned for one of her books about her life with Custer. And particularly, she wanted to show the affection and the relationship that Custer had with the dogs. It was very difficult to capture this sort of thing in photographs. So Libbie had this illustration made. And after the Civil War, Custer gets posted to Texas, and he ends up having a large pack of greyhounds, foxhounds, and deerhounds. And he hunts deer, they hunt wolves, they hunt jackrabbit, they hunt buffalo and elk, and he just becomes a hunting guy. He writes letters to the newspapers and hunting magazines and talks about his hunting prowess and his pedigreed dogs and how great and wonderful all this stuff is. He gets transferred further west, and go ahead and give me the next slide. So in Kansas, so the picture on the left is Custer in Kansas, and his first 3 Scottish deerhounds are with him. And you can see on the left, the seated dog with the blurred head is Flirt. The white dog in the middle, just below Custer, is Blucher, named for the Prussian general who saved the day at Waterloo. And then on the right is Maida, named after a very famous Scottish hound. And those were Custer's first and favorite dogs. He tended to reuse names an awful lot. There were a couple of Bluchers, there were a couple of Maidas. So this was taken in 1868 in Fort Dodge, Kansas. And then down at the bottom on the right, you can see a pelican. Custer was real big into collecting specimens and sending them back home to friends and things like that. And this pelican was captured in Kansas, and they sent it back in a crate to Detroit for the Audubon Society. Unfortunately, the penguin died on the way. Pelican died on the way. But they stuffed it and mounted it in the Audubon Society Club. The image on the right is taken of 1874. This is in the Black Hills expedition in South Dakota. And you see Custer seated there. He's wearing buckskins and the usual beard that he had on expeditions. The Indian pointing at the map is Bloody Knife, his favorite scout. The soldier standing behind him is probably John Berkman, his dog tender and horse tender. The other two are Indian scouts. We don't know their names. And then you can see a Scottish deerhound and a sleeping greyhound beside him, because he always took dogs on the expeditions. So I think, right. So my next passage I'm going to read to you is one of the more moving things that Custer wrote about his dogs. And he took them very seriously. Neither he nor Libbie write much about their dogs' deaths. And so when you read Custer's letters, when they stop talking about a dog, it's probably because it's dead or they've gone missing. And there were only 2 dogs that he really said much about. And but he goes on and he writes very, very emotionally about this one dog, Tuck, which was one of his last dogs. So from camp and in this tent, Custer writes, "I think I'm going to become more warmly attached to Tuck than any dog I have ever owned. She is, if anything, more affectionate than Lulu, and so fast she can outstrip Blucher as if he were a cur. I think I told you of her catching a full-grown antelope buck and pulling him down after a run of over a mile, in which she left all the other dogs far behind. She comes to me almost every evening when I'm sitting in one of my large, comfortable camp chairs, listening to the band or joining with the other officers in conversation. First, she will come and lay her head on my knee, as if to ask if I am too much engaged to notice her. A few moments in this posture, I give her a pat of encouragement, and then her forefeet are on my lap. Then she lifts her hind feet from the ground, and great overgrown dog that she is, quietly and gently disposes herself in my lap, and at times will cuddle there and sleep for an hour at a time, until I become so tired of my charge that I am compelled to transfer her to Mother Earth, and even then she resembles a well-cared for and half-spoiled child who can never be induced to retire until it has been fondled to sleep in its mother's arms. Tuck will sleep so soundly in my lap that I can transfer her gently to the ground and she will continue her slumber, like a little baby deposited in its crib. As I write, she is laying at my feet. She makes up with me like no other person." So let's move on to the end of the story and a curious event. We're approaching the time of Little Bighorn when Custer was killed. There's a nice portrait of him in civilian clothes taken very late in his life, literally the months before he was killed. The picture down below is a favorite of mine. That's John Berkman, his dog tender and horse minder. And then behind him, you can see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Scottish deerhounds kind of scattered around. Now, at this time at Fort Abraham Lincoln near Bismarck, North Dakota, Custer had some 40 to 50 staghounds. And Custer uses the term staghounds, but these were probably Scottish deerhounds, and he had foxhounds as well, too. So this is just kind of a nice sampling of what life was like with dogs scattered all over the place. And you know, Custer was commanding officer of the 7th in the field. And of course, commanding officers don't have to pick up dog poop. You have soldiers do that for you, or you have soldiers who are on, you know, jail or KP duty do that sort of thing for you. So it's very easy for you to have 40 dogs if you have other people taking care of. So this photograph was taken probably in the spring of 1875. And you may know that Little Bighorn happened in June of 1876. So this is very, very late in his life. And go ahead and miss the next slide, Nancy. So I've chosen here one of the more famous, but not terribly accurate depictions of the Last Stand, Custer's Last Stand. This was, I think, completed about in the late 1890s. But the artist who did this actually talked with eyewitness participants who survived the other battle of Little Bighorn that happened on Hill. Everybody in Custer's command was wiped out, but there was a second stand of soldiers who survived. And the reliable officers gave information about what people were wearing, what did, you know, the Sioux and Cheyenne look like. And the artist was going to put Custer's dogs in this painting until he talked to Lieutenant Godfrey, who reliably told him, no, Custer's dogs were left at the supply depot. Now, Custer had brought 4 stag hounds along on the trip: Kaiser, Tuck, Swift, and Lady. But in the last march up to the actual battlefield, he knew he was going to be moving fast. There wouldn't be food for the dogs. Custer liked to bring ambulances along. When his dogs were too tired, they'd ride in the ambulance. And they were going to be moving fast on horses with a mule train, and there wouldn't be any ambulances. So his 4 dogs went partway to Little Bighorn, but they were left at the supply depot. So when Custer's killed, Libbie Custer is now a widow with 40 or more dogs to find homes for, and then sort out Custer's affairs. And she has no status as an Army widow, only a meager pension, and she can't live in the house anymore. So she has to find homes for the dogs, and she's going to go back home to Monroe and grieve and try and figure out what she's going to do with the rest of her life. And you have to remember, this was in a time when respectable women didn't have jobs. It was the sort of thing just didn't happen. And so Libbie doesn't know how she's going to make herself a living. So Libbie asks her fellow officers and a friend in Minneapolis to see about finding homes for these dogs. And a fellow by the name of C.W. McIntyre puts an ad in a sporting magazine. And then this notice is repeated in newspapers all across the country and in the territories that if you want to give a good home to a dog, there are Custer staghounds and foxhounds available. And all you need to do is pay the shipping and you can have a Custer dog. This was the first ever national rescue effort for dogs. And this happened in 1876. All of Custer's dogs found home. Teddy Roosevelt remembers hunting in North Dakota with dogs that were descended from Custer's pack. It was something of a cachet to say that you had a Custer dog or you had puppies from a Custer dog. So they found homes for all of them. Libbie gave particular instructions for one dog to go to a certain person. Here's a picture of her in middle age, later middle age. She's wearing a ball dress here. She wore black widow's weeds for the rest of her life. Never ever married, never ever had a dog again, never visited Little Bighorn. Those memories were just too painful for her. She ended up making quite a good living for herself by writing books and articles and then giving lectures. So she ended up being poor at all. She did very well for herself. So this one dog, Cardigan, was one of her favorite dogs, another of her heart dogs. And this was a large white staghound that had been in a fight with a bunch of the other dogs once, and he'd gotten torn to pieces. They stitched him up, and he had months to recover, and he stayed in the house with Libbie. And they bonded very, very tightly. And she describes him crawling up into her lap, this great, huge, giant hound. And she was very small. She was like 5'4", 5'5", something like that. Very petite person. And she got this big dog sitting in her lap. So Cardigan was her second real heart dog that she writes about. And I'll just digress here for a second. Cardigan, Custer named him after Lord Cardigan, who led the charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. He was real big on naming his dog after heroes or Roman gods and things like that. So Libbie gives instructions that Cardigan is to be given to the Reverend Cassius Terry of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the Reverend Terry was a friend of theirs. When you were coming and going from the east to the west, Minneapolis was one of the last places that you stopped, to break your journey and rest, and before you're catching a different train line out to Bismarck. And so they would have known Reverend Terry from the society there. So they give Reverend Terry Cardigan. And Cardigan is a great pet in the neighborhood. He's well known to everybody. Sadly, Reverend Terry had tuberculosis, and Cardigan died just before he did in 1881. And as a tribute to General Custer and a brave dog, Cardigan's body was given to the best taxidermist in town, and he was mounted. And Cassius Terry then gave Cardigan to the University Museum in their natural history department. And he was set up there in the museum as Custer's dog. And he was there for many, many years. And a lot of people remember seeing him there. And, by about 1914, he was starting to get a little moth-eaten, a little worn out, faded from sunlight, and people weren't so interested in General Custer anymore. And eventually, at one point, they were purging the collection, and the fellow who was the curator of the museum ordered Cardigan's mount to be thrown out, and he was tossed on the trash heap. And then a janitor spotted it, pulled it out, recognized it, and kept it for a while, and then it gave it to what was called the Dime Museum. And these museums were patterned after P.T. Barnum's famous museum in New York, where you paid a dime to get in, and there were all kinds of curiosities, might even be a music show or a lecture or something like that. But this particular Dime Museum in Minneapolis had an exhibit of flora and fauna from the Northwest. And so Cardigan was set up there with all these stuffed animals, and he may or may not have been identified as Cardigan. He might just have been identified as a big dog, or he might have even been identified as a wolf too, for all we know. But people remember seeing him in this Dime Museum for a number of years. And then sometime probably in, the late teens, he disappears, the museum is sold, and Cardigan disappears entirely. So in the 1920s, there was a dog show in Minneapolis, and somebody said, hey, whatever happened to Custer's dog that was in the museum? And there was a bunch of articles, letters to the editor over a period of about 6 days, where everybody's remembering what happened to Cardigan. And what you see down here at the right is an illustration of what Cardigan might have looked like on display. And the general conclusion was that the mount had gotten so moth-eaten and ratty that eventually even the Dime Museum didn't want it, and it was thrown out. Now, in taxidermy practices in Victorian Edwardian times, and I believe this is true today, the skeleton is never included with the body. It's kept separately for study, or thrown away if you don't need it. So inside the body, it's a wire form, sometimes plywood, and then stuff's sawdust or straw, things like that. So a university professor at the University of Minnesota remembers in the 1960s seeing a skull, a large dog skull, on a shelf with a label saying it belonged to Custer's dog. And this was in the 1960s. This university professor saw it. So in writing my book, I wrote to the current curator of the museum, and I said, hey, this professor says he saw this in the 60s. And the professor who runs the museum was very kind. She did a search for me, and she says, nope, there's nothing like that anywhere around. She says, we don't think it's there. Now, I've worked for universities, and I know there's a lot of weird stuff that gets left in the catacombs and the basements and stuff like that. And I think it's remotely possible that in a box covered with dust in a drawer somewhere, that skull is still there, or else it got pinched by somebody who's a Custer fan and maybe has it on display somewhere. But for all intents and purposes, that skull is gone. However, when Cardigan lived with Cassius Terry, he sired several puppies, litters of puppies in the neighborhood. It was well known. People said, yeah, we have puppies from Cardigan. So it's just possible that those puppies grew up, they had puppies. And so there might be a little bit of Cardigan, Custer's dog DNA walking around the neighborhoods of Minneapolis today. So with that, you can do the next slide, Nancy, and I'll say thank you for listening and happy landings to you all.
I got to unmute myself. All right, fantastic, Brian. What great stories you have. And I know you've got a lot more stories. So before we open this up to questions, I want to give a shout out to you and the different books that you've got, because obviously you really have done your homework. You've done a great deal of research in these stories. So if any of our audience is interested in finding any of your books and keeping up with these stories, here you go on Amazon or straight from Brian, you can find his books. That was fantastic. Now we have Brenda Townsend, our Director of Education, who's behind the scenes here since Leah Block is in Washington, D.C., getting ready for the Arsenal of Democracy flyover. So
Yeah.
Brenda, do we have any questions that have come in from our audience?
We do. You've already answered one of where can I learn more, so those books will be going off the shelves pretty quick. All right, so from Duncan, we have a couple of questions. Was General George S. Patton's dog Willie, okay, was he a dog lover, or is the film portrayal of him and his dog accurate?
I will confess that I am not as up on General Patton as I might be. My understanding is that he was a dog lover. he certainly was a horseman. He was a trained cavalryman. I believe, he did have, the white bull terrier that was depicted in the movie. I don't know how much of the stuff in the movie about the dog being scared, by the little Pekingese is true or not, but I believe Patton was a dog lover. Just to what extent on the scale, I can't tell you.
Great. All right. And Duncan's other question is, in the history of military dogs in service, do any other dogs apart from Sergeant Stubby of the 26th Division have official military ranks?
I know that the dogs that are in service today, such as Cairo, that was, on the raid on Osama bin Laden, they have their special ranks. And I'm not a soldier. I've never been in the military. And I've studied, I tend to study the old stuff more than the new stuff, but I am told that those dogs have special ranks so that, they get some respect and treatment no matter what, that they're not just privates. Of course, Sergeant Stubby's rank was honorary. A lot of these awards are kind of informal and everybody just calls them that. There are horses that have military ranks as well, too. Some horses actually have had military funerals, and that's a very special thing when that happens. But I have to confess that I'm not aware of any other dog other than Sergeant Stubby that has that rank. But there's a lot of stories about dogs out there. Certainly the military dogs that were used in the Pacific by the Marine Corps, and the ones that were used by American Army forces in Europe. There wasn't much activity with the American military and dogs during World War I because we got into it late in the war, and we didn't have a canine force at the time. We had to use British dogs in our operations over there, but they sort of figured out this might be a good idea to have it on tap, should there ever be a conflict again. So I hope that sort of answers your question as far as I'm able to.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. Well, we've got some feedback. There was a great presentation and a fresh approach to this. This last question is, I guess, for Nancy. Is this webinar available to see again?
Absolutely. On our CAF YouTube channel, we have all of our webinars. You can watch them over and over and over again and take notes. And for those of you who have dog stories, is it okay that they submit them to you, Brian? If our audience has some little tidbit of military history and animal use, can they send it to you?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear those stories. Oftentimes, I get inspired by what people tell me. And as I said, these things don't end up in history books unless someone tells someone who tells someone, and then someone writes it down. So yeah, if there's an interesting, dog story about your friend or relative in the military or yourself, I'd love to hear about it.
And would you tell us what the next story you're working on is? Can you give us a little teaser?
Yeah, I can. I consider myself a canine historian, and I just love telling stories about dogs. And the next book is a little bit of a departure. I was a film major in college, and when I was working on the Custer book, I was watching a lot of movies and just kind of seeing how dogs are treated in there, and I became particularly intrigued as to how dogs are depicted in horror movies. And I got to thinking about, well, when did dogs start becoming villains, on screen in horror movies? And so I actually, when I submitted my Custer manuscript, I started working on this. So the next book is tentatively titled Horror Dogs, How Man's Best Friend Became Cinema Hellhounds. And it's a look at how we started depicting dogs as villains or agents of evil, whereas there's a 40-year history of dogs being perfectly fine and wonderful in our health friends in film. Then all of a sudden, it was in one particular decade, and then the doors open and you have Cujos and Zoltan, the Hound of Dracula, which is a strange film. But so yeah, that's my next film I'm working on, and book that I'm working on, and that'll, if God willing and the creek don't rise, that might be published in 2 years.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brian. It has been such a pleasure to learn these stories firsthand from you. Fascinating history. I actually majored in history because I had a great storyteller as a professor, so I changed from math, which doesn't lend itself to great stories, to history, and never looked back. So glad to have this great to spend time with you. Thank you. And I know our audience is looking forward to learning more about you and reading some books. So I hope they'll jump in and buy some of your books. And if our audience likes Commemorative Air Force webinars, I hope they'll consider supporting that. And we've got a couple of big events coming up. This Friday is the flyover of the Arsenal of Democracy in Washington, D.C., flying over the mall. So if anybody wants to catch that, this can be live broadcast at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and you can find the links to that on our CAF website. And of course, Saturday is Girls in Aviation Day, and the Commemorative Air Force is one of the sponsors of that. So if you've got a young girl who's interested in getting into something in aviation, look up Girls in Aviation Day. You'll find all sorts of online activities for this year's event. Brian, again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure spending time with you, and we'll look forward to catching up with you later.
Well, thank you, Nancy. It was a delight to be here and a privilege. We'll see you later.
Okay, thank you.